The first note drifted through the cathedral at exactly midnight, low and trembling like a voice awakening from a centuries-long sleep. Daniel Mercer froze in the narrow guest chamber provided by the parish, certain he had imagined it. Then a second note followed, deeper and darker, vibrating through the stone walls beneath his feet. He sat upright in bed and listened as the melody slowly unfolded. The sound was unmistakably coming from the cathedral's massive pipe organ. Yet he remembered clearly that the instrument had been locked after evening prayers. Outside his window, rain lashed against the ancient stained glass. The storm clouds swallowed the moon and left the village buried in darkness. Every gust of wind seemed to carry the music farther into the sleeping streets. Daniel grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the cold corridor. The cathedral was silent, except for the distant song of the organ. Each note echoed with unnatural clarity, as though the building itself were singing. The deeper he ventured, the stranger the melody became. It did not sound like any hymn he had ever heard. The music carried an unsettling sadness that tightened around his chest. His flashlight beam danced across towering columns and faded religious paintings. Shadows stretched along the floor like black rivers flowing toward the sanctuary. The organ continued playing without pause. When Daniel reached the nave, he stopped in disbelief. Hundreds of empty pews faced the altar in complete stillness. Beyond them, the enormous organ pipes rose into darkness above the choir loft. The melody suddenly shifted into a sequence of notes so sharp that they made his skin crawl. For a brief moment, he thought he heard faint voices buried beneath the music. They sounded distant and desperate, like whispers trapped behind stone. Daniel climbed the winding staircase leading to the organ chamber. The wooden steps groaned beneath his weight. The music grew louder with every step until it filled the air around him. At the top, he pushed open the heavy door, expecting to find a musician. The room beyond was completely empty. Dust covered every surface, and the organ bench stood abandoned beneath the towering instrument. The music stopped the instant he crossed the threshold. A terrible silence rushed in, leaving only the pounding of his heartbeat. Daniel slowly swept his flashlight across the room, searching for any sign of movement. That was when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh footprints were visible in the thick dust around the organ bench. They began near the instrument and led directly into the cathedral wall, ending where solid stone should have made passage impossible. The following morning, Daniel could not shake the memory of the footprints disappearing into solid stone. Every logical explanation he considered seemed to collapse under closer inspection. By sunrise, he had convinced himself that the cathedral was hiding something far older than structural damage. The rain had ended, but a heavy grey sky still hung above the village. Daniel spent the morning examining cracked walls and weakened arches, yet his attention kept drifting toward the distant organ loft. Several workers from the village arrived to assist with the restoration project. They joked and chatted freely while unloading equipment. The moment Daniel mentioned the organ, however, an uneasy silence settled over the group. One elderly laborer lowered his eyes and crossed himself. Another quickly changed the subject and walked away without answering. Their reactions only deepened Daniel's growing curiosity. By afternoon, he made his way to the cathedral archives beneath the main sanctuary. The room smelled of dust, wax, and decaying paper. Shelves packed with ancient records stretched into the darkness. A single lamp illuminated a large wooden desk near the center of the chamber. Daniel began searching through parish histories and restoration reports. Most contained nothing unusual beyond centuries of routine church affairs. Hours passed before he discovered a damaged ledger, hidden between larger volumes. The leather cover was cracked and stained with age. Several pages appeared to have been deliberately torn away. The remaining entries described a gifted organist named Elias Voss, who had served the cathedral nearly 300 years earlier. According to the records, his music drew visitors from distant cities. Then, without explanation, his name vanished from church documents entirely. Daniel continued searching and uncovered a collection of handwritten letters. Many referenced strange midnight performances that occurred after the cathedral had closed. Witnesses described hearing impossible melodies echoing through empty halls. One letter stood apart from the others because of its frantic tone. The writer claimed Elias had discovered a sacred composition hidden within forbidden manuscripts. He warned that the music was never meant to be played before abruptly ending mid-sentence. As evening approached, Daniel found a folded map tucked inside the ledger's back cover. It showed the cathedral's original design before later renovations altered the structure. Several passages marked on the drawing no longer appeared on modern plans. The final discovery waited on the map's reverse side. Written in faded ink were 4 chilling words that sent a shiver through him. They read, "The walls still sing." The walls began whispering just after midnight, moments before the organ returned. Daniel was studying the old map in his guest chamber when the first faint murmur reached his ears. It sounded like several voices speaking at once from somewhere deep inside the stone. He grabbed his flashlight and hurried into the cathedral corridors. The building felt colder than it had the previous night. Even the air carried a damp chill that seemed to cling to his skin. The organ's melody emerged again from the darkness above. Its notes floated through the cathedral with eerie precision. This time, however, the whispers accompanied every measure of the music. Daniel followed the sounds toward a forgotten section of the cathedral shown on the ancient map. Thick layers of dust covered the floor. Few people had apparently entered the area for decades. The passage ended at a wall concealed behind rotting wooden panels. Strange symbols had been carved into the stone beneath them. Their shapes resembled twisted musical notes woven into circles and crosses. As he traced one symbol with his flashlight, the whispers suddenly grew louder. The voices no longer sounded distant or indistinct. For a terrifying moment, he thought he heard his own name spoken among them. His pulse quickened as he searched for the source. The sounds seemed to travel through the walls themselves. It was as though dozens of unseen mouths were trapped within the cathedral's stone. Determined to continue, Daniel examined the structure more closely. He discovered a narrow seam running vertically through the ancient masonry. Hidden behind centuries of repairs was the outline of a sealed doorway. The organ melody shifted into a darker arrangement. Every note now carried a strange emotional weight that filled him with dread. Images he could not explain flickered briefly through his mind. He saw pale figures kneeling beneath candlelight in a vast chamber. Their faces appeared blurred and ghost-like. At the center stood a musician playing before an audience that seemed entirely dead. The vision vanished when a violent bang echoed somewhere above him. Daniel spun around and raised his flashlight toward the corridor. For an instant, he glimpsed a tall shadow standing at the far end before it slipped around a corner. His fear battled against his curiosity as he rushed after it. The corridor beyond was completely empty when he arrived, yet carved into the dusty floor beneath the sealed doorway were fresh words that had not been there moments earlier. Find the chamber before the final performance. The sealed doorway opened with a grinding roar that echoed through the cathedral before dawn. Daniel had spent hours searching for a mechanism hidden within the ancient masonry. When the stone finally shifted inward, a wave of icy air poured from the darkness beyond. His flashlight revealed a narrow staircase descending beneath the cathedral. The steps were worn smooth by countless feet long forgotten. Every instinct urged him to turn back, yet the whispers pulled him forward. The deeper he descended, the stronger the voices became. They no longer sounded scattered or distant. Instead, they merged into a mournful chorus that seemed to rise from the earth itself. At the bottom of the staircase, he entered a vast underground chamber. Massive stone pillars supported the ceiling above. Hundreds of melted candles surrounded a circular platform carved with strange musical symbols. Ancient murals covered the walls from floor to ceiling. They depicted a gifted organist standing before crowds of worshippers. As Daniel examined them more closely, the images gradually became darker and more disturbing. The later murals showed pale figures emerging from shadows whenever the organist played. Their hollow eyes were fixed upon him with unnatural devotion. In every scene, the musician appeared increasingly frightened by his own creation. Near the center of the chamber stood a stone altar covered in brittle manuscripts. Daniel carefully opened one of the surviving books. The pages described a composer named Elias Voss and the composition he had hidden from the world. According to the writings, Elias had discovered an ancient melody buried within forbidden texts. The music was said to bridge the boundary separating life from death. Those who heard it could call spirits from beyond the grave. At first, Elias believed the composition was a divine gift. He performed it in secret and witnessed impossible miracles. The dead appeared briefly among the living, offering messages and visions to grieving families. The miracles soon transformed into horrors that spread throughout the village. Spirits refused to return to the darkness after being summoned. Strange deaths followed each performance, and frightened residents reported seeing ghostly figures wandering the cathedral at night. The final pages revealed the desperate actions taken by church leaders. Fearing catastrophe, they seized Elias during a midnight recital. Rather than destroy him, they imprisoned him alive within hidden chambers inside the cathedral walls. Daniel's hands trembled as he reached the manuscript's final sentence. The truth was far worse than he had imagined. Elias had died within the stone prison, but his spirit never stopped playing the forbidden melody that continued to trap countless souls beneath the cathedral. The anniversary arrived beneath a sky blackened by thunderclouds, and the cathedral seemed to sense it. Long before midnight, strange vibrations pulsed through the ancient stone like the beating of a buried heart. Daniel felt them beneath his feet wherever he walked. The manuscripts had revealed the date of Elias Voss's imprisonment. 3 centuries had passed since that terrible night. Now the final performance described in the records was only hours away. As darkness settled over the village, an unnatural fog crept through the streets. It flowed between houses and wrapped itself around the cathedral walls. No wind disturbed it, and no sound came from the sleeping town. Daniel remained inside the sanctuary, watching the massive organ looming above the empty pews. The air grew steadily colder as midnight approached. Frost began spreading across the edges of stained glass windows, despite the season. When the clock struck 12, the first note exploded through the cathedral. The pipes thundered with a force unlike anything Daniel had heard before. The sound shook dust from the rafters and rattled every window. The melody surged through the building like a living thing. Notes collided and spiraled upward into impossible harmonies. The cathedral seemed to tremble beneath the weight of the music. Then the pews began filling with figures that had not entered through any door. Pale silhouettes emerged from the fog, drifting along the floor. One by one, ghostly worshippers appeared in silent rows facing the altar. Their faces reflected centuries of suffering and sorrow. Some wore clothing from forgotten eras. Others bore wounds and marks that suggested terrible deaths. Daniel backed away as more spirits materialized around him. The whispers he had heard within the walls now echoed openly through the sanctuary. Hundreds of voices merged into a chorus of grief and desperation. The organ continued playing without a visible musician. Yet Daniel suddenly noticed movement in the choir loft. A thin figure sat at the organ bench, its hands gliding across the keys with unnatural speed. Moonlight briefly pierced the storm clouds and illuminated the performer. The figure's body appeared half-transparent as though it existed between worlds. Daniel recognized the gaunt face from the murals hidden beneath the cathedral. Elias Voss had returned to complete the ritual he began centuries earlier. As the melody reached a terrifying crescendo, cracks spread across the sanctuary walls. From those fractures emerged countless shadowy forms, and Daniel realized with horror that the imprisoned souls were no longer trying to escape the cathedral. They were being gathered for something far worse. The shadows poured from the cracked walls as the cathedral shook around them. Ghostly worshippers remained seated in absolute silence while the organ thundered through the sanctuary. Daniel understood that if the ritual reached its final note, whatever waited beyond the veil would fully enter the world. He forced himself toward the choir loft, despite the chaos surrounding him. Every step felt heavier than the last. The air itself seemed to resist his movement. Above him, Elias Voss continued playing with impossible speed. His translucent fingers blurred across the keys. The melody had become so powerful that the stone pillars vibrated with each note. Daniel reached the loft and shouted the organist's name. The music faltered for a fraction of a second. Elias slowly turned his head, revealing eyes filled not with malice but unbearable sorrow. For the first time, the spirit spoke. His voice sounded like many voices layered together through centuries of suffering. He claimed he had never intended to unleash darkness upon the world. Elias explained that the forbidden composition had trapped not only wandering spirits but his own soul as well. Every midnight, performance strengthened the prison surrounding him. The ritual was no longer opening a doorway, but feeding a cycle that could never end. The shadowy forms gathering below were the consequence of that cycle. Countless souls had become bound to the melody over 300 years. If the composition reached completion tonight, they would remain imprisoned forever. Daniel remembered a passage from the ancient manuscripts. It described only one way to destroy the melody completely. Someone living had to play the final sequence and willingly take the organist's place. The realization struck him like a physical blow. Elias had been trying to guide him toward the hidden chamber and the truth all along. The messages in the dust and the whispers in the walls had never been threats. The cathedral groaned as enormous cracks spread across the ceiling. Chunks of stone crashed into the sanctuary below. The final measures of the composition approached with terrifying speed. Without allowing himself time to hesitate, Daniel pushed Elias away from the bench. The spirit stared at him in shock as he sat before the keys. Then Daniel began playing the final sequence exactly as it appeared in the manuscripts. A blinding wave of sound erupted through the cathedral. The ghostly congregation dissolved into streams of silver light, and the shadowy forms screamed as they were dragged into darkness. When the last note faded, the souls vanished, the cracks sealed, and Elias finally disappeared in peace. The cathedral fell silent for the first time in 3 centuries. Days later, villagers found the building abandoned and strangely untouched by the destruction that should have occurred. Yet every year at midnight on the anniversary of the ritual, a single mournful note echoes from the organ, and those who hear it swear they can see a lone figure seated at the bench, patiently guarding the dead from within the cathedral walls.